Hey, I'm Emerson Murphy-Hill, presenting this paper, Engineering Impacts of Anonymous Author Code Review, a Field Experiment. So the problem that we're trying to solve in this paper is this problem that's been observed in a bunch of pieces of prior work about what appears to be bias in code review. So one of these was this paper we published in 2017 about GitHub, which showed that uh, women on GitHub, if they present themselves as women, that is, they use a profile picture and they use a gendered name. They tend to have lower acceptance rates than men if they're outsiders from a project. But if they use sort of a gender neutral profile, they use a gender neutral name and they don't actually use a profile picture, they actually tend to do better than men. And so after you sort of control for a bunch of things, it turns out that it seems like what's going on is typical gender bias. This finding has also been replicated for race and ethnicity. So Nadri, Rodriguez Paris, and Nagapan observed that authors on GitHub who are Black, Asian or Pacific Islander, or Hispanic tend to have lower acceptance rates than folks who present as white. And then we've replicated these findings also in a corporate context where we found that when you look at this notion of pushback, so essentially more feedback that signals a negative code review experience, women are more likely to have these high pushback code reviews. Folks who are Black, folks who are Hispanic or Latinx, folks who are Asian also tend to get more pushback than folks who are white. And then also we extended it to age as well. We found that sort of after you control for seniority, the older you get, the more likely as an author you are to get a higher pushback review. And so this suggests that author's identity has some effect on the way that reviewers treat them. And so, sort of in response to this, we wanted to see whether this idea of anonymous code review would work as a reasonable like engineering tool, because every code review system I know of tend to use non-anonymous code review where it's got the author's name and the code review tool. So here, for instance, is Google's sort of main code review tool Critique. And what we've done is it says this is a changeless number, blah, 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 by typically someone's name. And instead of putting the person's name there, we just put redacted essentially. And it's pretty simple change. Jill Dicker, one of the co-authors, implemented this as an extension to Chrome, and we asked a bunch of people to use it. And so what we wanted to know essentially six things. We wanted to know, one challenge here is people often say, well, I can guess the identity of my reviewers. So we wanted to know how often that happened. We wanted to know whether it changed people's reviewing velocity, how long it took them to review. The third question, we wanted to know they're treated or how they're treating others. What do engineers perceive as the biggest advantages and disadvantage of using this particular tool? And like this was a sort of prototype implementation. What features would we need for a real implementation deployed at scale? And so what we did is we had about 400 engineers at Google use anonymous code review. Some of them used it as we implemented, and some of them were sort of in a control group where they did their typical reviews. And essentially, they did it for a few weeks. And really briefly, I'm going to answer three of these questions and then dig in a little bit more depth on the other three. So the first one is research question 2. How does anonymous author code review change reviewers' velocity? It turns out the same. If as a reviewer, if you don't know the author's identity, you typically review at about the same pace that you did previously. How does anonymous author code review change review quality? Review quality seemed to be about the same based on people's perceptions, but there were some signals that people thought that they were doing a higher quality review when they didn't have the author's identity included. And There did seem to be fewer rollbacks, that is essentially reversions of code reviews that have been submitted in the anonymous group. So maybe a little bit of evidence that the review quality was higher. For research question 5, what are the biggest advantages and disadvantages? Just really briefly, some of the advantages that people saw were that they thought they were doing a more thorough review when they didn't have to think about people's identity, and they also thought that they were doing less biased reviews. So those are sort of the most common advantages. Disadvantages, I didn't list them here, but a disadvantage was that people thought that it kind of reduced their ability to know what their teammates were working on. I mean, they sort of already knew from other contexts what their teammates were doing, but actually, it felt like the more anonymous reviews they did, the less they knew about what their teammates were doing, which is kind of interesting. Okay, and then returning to the first question in a little bit more depth, how often can reviewers guess author identities? So we divided this question up into two different types of reviews. We've got sort of normal, typical reviews that you'd see, outside of Google, essentially, typically teammates reviewing teammates. And then we have these things called readability reviews. The details aren't super important, except to say that with a readability review, you get essentially a randomly assigned reviewer within Google, and you typically don't know who they are. And so, as you could expect, and for normal reviews with people that you work with, typically you know what people are working on, so you can make a correct guess about for about 3/4 of the time who the author is. For readability reviews, where reviewers and authors are essentially paired up randomly, most 95% of the time you can't tell. Okay, so what this says is that for the typical types of reviews you think of, yeah, you can guess a lot, but for certain types of reviews, it's much harder. I think this is interesting to think about open source software, which is probably more like the latter, where a lot of times you'll get changes from some random person. In that case, I think you're probably more in the right category, the readability reviews, where you're less likely to know author identity. Research question 4, how does this affect perceptions of fairness? This is interesting because uh, you actually wouldn't necessarily expect people on the whole to be treated more fairly with anonymous code review. It may be that most people actually feel that they're being treated less fairly because what we noticed in prior work is that very senior authors tend to get less pushback than junior authors. And so if identity is hidden and you don't know that it's a very senior person making a change, you actually might give them more pushback than if you had known who they were. But generally, the results here showed that uh, authors felt that their reviews, who didn't know who the authors felt that the reviews were about as fair in terms of their expectations. Um, and a few people felt less fairly, and a few people feel that they were treated more fairly. Now, there's one result here that I want to point you at. It's in the readability reviews, the more fairly than expected row. 6.5% of reviews people felt in the treatment group, that is, people who are using anonymous review, the authors felt they were treated more fairly, but 17%, quite a few more, felt that they were being treated more fairly in the control group. And that's a statistically significant difference. We're pretty surprised that the control group actually was showing more fair reviews. We added this post-study column where we looked at these folks' reviews after we took away their anonymous code review. It turns out we got unlucky in some sense. The control reviewers turned out to just essentially were more likely to give essentially fair reviews, or maybe even surprisingly fair reviews in the control group. So we were able to correct for that, but it was a surprise. Okay, and then research question 6: what features are particularly important for anonymous code review? Um, so one thing is the ability to unanonymize an author during review. Turns out more than half of the users thought that this was an essential feature. Um, and part of the reason is for some types of changes, you need to have a high bandwidth conversation. And it turns out people rarely unanonymize. And so when they did, people thought that was a really important feature to have. Versus a feature that was maybe less important, showing which reviewers press the unanonymize button. Some people, quite a few people thought that was an unwise feature to have. A bunch of people were neutral. Okay, so what's next? I think the missing piece, obviously, for this paper is we sort of the feature is designed to reduce bias in code review, and we didn't really show that that wasn't really a goal of this particular study. We weren't able to really show that bias was reduced. So that's obviously future work. Um, and since this paper has been published, we implemented a real implementation in the code review tool. We use the cute anonymous animals that you get with Google Docs. And so there's a bunch of engineers who are using anonymous code review today inside of Google. And here's a little peek of what that tool looks like. Thanks very much.